Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Secretary Thomas Modly.
Wow, are they going to have that picture up the whole time? That's not good. I was speaking at the Sea, Air, and Space Conference in Washington, D.C., which is a huge conference. We usually have like 3,000 people there, and I was speaking at that conference at lunchtime and sitting in a seat similar to that one. And they had that goofy picture of me up. And I mean, a picture placed 3 times, 4 times this size. And the screens were about as big as this stage, so I'm sitting there trying to eat my lunch, staring at myself. And as I start to walk up on the stage, I realize I'm wearing the exact same outfit as I was wearing in the picture. So now I never wear that same tie and jacket combination because it's a little disconcerting. And now I see it staring at me right now as I give this speech. So, well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's really an honor for me to be here. I love coming to this area for lots of reasons. But thank you, Amy, and thanks to you, Brian, as well, for the invitation to be here. This came up on my calendar, and I said I'm absolutely going to keep it, even though we have some big issues that I'm dealing with right now in the Navy. But thank you also to all of you from the Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce and for the kind invitation. It's just really great to be here. As some of you may know, this is my second trip here to this area as Acting Secretary of the Navy. My first was to participate in the christening of the newest United States ship, John F. Kennedy, CVN 79, and I did that on Saturday outside. It was a cold day, but it was really a spectacular event with profound historical significance that continues the legacy of the proud ties this community has to our long and distinguished naval heritage. But despite the triumph of that day for our Navy, our souls have been deeply marked with great sorrow for the senseless and horrific losses of life within our own naval family over the last few weeks. One not far from here in Little Creek, others in Pearl Harbor last Wednesday, and of course the tragic events Friday morning in Pensacola. We are determined as one naval family to find the causes of these senseless murders and to stand united, for they are truly crimes that are committed against all of us. As members of the broadest definition of the U.S. Naval Service, sailors, Marines, contractors, law enforcement, and communities like yours, everyday Americans who rely on the Navy to keep us all safe and free. The accounts I'm learning as I'm getting more into the facts of this situation of immense courage, particularly in Pensacola, are still fully to be collected, but what we do know is that the bravery of 3 heroes wearing the cloth of our nation who ran towards danger on that early Friday morning in a schoolhouse of all places where it was least expected and made the ultimate sacrifice for their brothers and sisters. And I'm going to mention their names, so at least for this moment, you know their names, and you can think about them. Airman Mohammed Sameh Haytham, 19 years old, from St. Petersburg, Florida. From what we're learning, Mohammed ran directly to and at the gunman with his arms like this, telling him to stop. Airman Apprentice Cameron Scott Walters, 21 years old, of Richmond Hill, Georgia. He had emailed his father on Thursday night telling him how proud he was because he finally qualified to stand the watch. And he was standing his first watch that Friday morning. And Ensign Joshua Caleb Watson, 23, from Coffee County, Alabama, who had just graduated from the United States Naval Academy in May of this year, a ceremony that I got to witness in person. It was a day of jubilation for Ensign Watson and his entire class, a day focused on the future, a day focused on his future. We are all heartbroken today that he will not fulfill it as he imagined he might have, on that day, but he has our commitment that his sacrifice will not be in vain. We pray for their families and for those even now who are fighting for their lives in the hospital. Directly after this event, I'm heading south to Pensacola to meet with some of the survivors and the incredible security response teams there from the Navy and Escambia County and other civilian and uniformed leaders in the Pensacola area. In trying times like this, some may wonder whether it is appropriate to keep appointments like this. But there is a higher purpose, one beyond all of us today. It faintly reminds us of Winston Churchill and how he felt about the appropriateness of a speech that he gave in Harvard in 1943, in the midst of a world war for the free peoples of the world, the fate of whom at that time was still very much uncertain. Churchill asked himself the same question in his speech and recalled how during the Blitz over London in 1941, he had kept his appointment for a similar ceremony. And he said, "The Blitz was running hard at that time, and the night before. The raid on Bristol had been heavy. Several hundreds had been killed and wounded. Many houses were destroyed. Buildings next to the university were still burning, and many university authorities who conducted the ceremony had pulled on their robes over uniforms, begrimed and drenched, but all was presented with faultless ritual and appropriate decorum. And I sustained a very strong and invigorating impression of the superiority of man over those forces that choose to destroy him." And as I look out over this audience today, just as I was honored on Saturday at a christening ceremony to look out over thousands of proud shipyard workers, sailors, and Marines, and proud citizens of the Hampton Roads area, I know that in times like these, as Americans and as a Navy family, we never retreat in the face of adversity. We don't give up the ship. We fight on. Within each of us, we must embrace that same honor, that same decorum, that same superiority of men and women over forces that also mean to destroy us, as Churchill described. Perhaps not with massive kinetic means, as in the world wars of the past, thankfully, but in ways that equally threaten our way of life. In short, our national security, economic, naval, and political security alike places great premium on the people of Hampton Roads. For here are the dedicated shipbuilders who endure, who help to build and ensure our future strength. Here are the suppliers and teammates who maintain and prepare our fleet. Here are the innovative researchers who sharpen that blade of innovation. And most importantly, here live the many military families who call this community home because they feel welcome here. Many of you are a part of that larger family of military and naval service, something of which my wife Robin and I are extremely proud ourselves. You know, Robin and I met just before my very last flight as a helicopter pilot on the UH-1 November. I was stationed here on board the USS Nassau from 1985 to 1987. And I met Robin at the first incarnation of Waterside down in Norfolk, way back in the last century, back when women wore leg warmers and men's hairstyles were a little bit different. That was our first date. Our second date was on the beach at 68th Street. Our third date was at Fort Story. So I have lots of memories of Virginia Beach. We happen to miss, because of the fact that I got transferred to a shore assignment from here, all the deployments and long separations that other couples have to deal with. And although I think that Robin may have wished for one or two deployments on occasion over the past 31 years of marriage, we are well aware that many of the families here in Hampton Roads will have an empty chair at their table this holiday season because a family member is a sailor or a Marine who was standing the watch as their duty calls them to. We will always think of ourselves as a Hampton Roads family. This is where we met. This is where, if I had not met 6 of the most precious souls to me, precious gifts to me, wouldn't be around right now. So we are aware of and thankful for many of the sacrifices extraordinary Americans, like those here in the Tidewater region and throughout our great nation, make every day to protect us all. In his final address to the nation, President Ronald Reagan explained that he saw the United States as a tall, proud city, built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, a city where free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity, a beacon for all who must desire freedom. And as President Reagan knew so well and taught us all, protecting that city and maintaining that beacon of freedom must be done through strength and through preparation. Today, it's our duty to ask ourselves if we are making the right investments, sparking the right innovation, and bringing the right capabilities to bear so that we can continue to stand not just for our freedom, our peace, and our prosperity, but those same things for the entire world. We must ask today if we see clearly the causes that have contributed to our gradual loss of competitive advantages that we enjoyed so much since the end of World War II. And we must think anew of how we must prepare a future naval force with the kind of agility to overcome these factors and to protect our American way of life. A few weeks ago, when I unexpectedly took on the role of acting Secretary of the Navy, foremost on my mind when thinking about the future was the very same thing that had been in my mind as the Undersecretary for the past 2 years. After Robin and I left Norfolk to move to Colorado Springs, I took a job as an assistant professor at the Air Force Academy. I know my introduction said Naval Academy, but it was the Air Force Academy. I was a transfer exchange professor on the faculty there as a Navy guy. And teaching those cadets, especially during the early morning classes, I would have to resort to some pretty creative ways and sometimes even devious means of capturing their attention because they're overwhelmed. They've got a lot of information and they have to process it and make choices about what they're going to prioritize their time over. Well, maybe like many of you in the late 1980s, I would try to stay awake late, although in the Mountain Time Zone it came on earlier, but I would stay up and watch a late night show, Late Night with David Letterman. But almost every night before teaching class, I would make sure to catch Dave's top 10 list. Because there were many times in those top 10 lists that I would find something interesting to mention in class that would have some relation to what we were talking about. And oftentimes that was a stretch, but it made them think. Now, Secretary Mattis once asked, once asked Mr. Secretary, what keeps you up at night? And Secretary Mattis answered, nothing, I keep other people up at night. Now, I'd have to say, if someone asked me that question, I wouldn't be that self-confident. I would probably answer something like, nothing, I'm actually really too tired to be kept up at night. So, that being said, I'm going to rely on my old tried and true David Letterman technique and give you a top 10 list today. Unfortunately, this list is not going to be as humorous as Letterman's list used to be, and there may not be as many surprises, but you never know. And if you asked me to give you this list on November 16th, 2017, the day before I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate for the Undersecretary job, I'm pretty sure the list would be different than it is today as I sit in the seat as the acting secretary. But here goes. Imagine the drum roll in your mind. This is Tom Modley's top 10 things that if things kept me up at night, it would be these 10 things. Number 10 is ships. We need more of them, and we need a lot more of them. Right now, our force is at about 290 ships. When I got out of the Navy in the late 90s, we were almost at a 600-ship Navy. We're at 290 right now. The President's goal was 355. The Congress put in law 355. And we are having a very difficult time getting there because of the cost of the ships that we have, an alignment on strategy, a national will to do it, but we need to have more ships. We simply cannot take on the broad security challenges that we have, which are getting more and more complicated around the world with the number of ships we have. So that's number 10. Number 9, speed. We absolutely have to do things faster. We simply cannot rely on old processes and old ways of doing business. I'm constantly amazed at how long it takes to get things done. One of my favorite stories is, that I've told as the Undersecretary is that it took me 6 weeks to get English muffins in the Secretary of the Navy mess. From my initial realization that we didn't have English muffins in the Secretary of the Navy's mess, and I mentioned it to someone that we should have them there, it took 6 weeks to get them in there. And the only way they got in there was because my Deputy Chief Learning Officer finally got so tired of me complaining about no English muffins that he went to the grocery store and bought a bag of them and put them in the refrigerator in the mess. Now, I like to reward that kind of innovative thinking. However, we need to do things faster, and this extends to everything that we're looking at, even with respect to our shipbuilding plan. The shipbuilding plan, 30-year shipbuilding plan that we have right now has us getting to 355 ships by the year 2052. Now, that's a long time from now. And I think about how much do we really know and understand about what the geostrategic context is going to be in 2052, and I think back to what was going on 30 years ago, about the time that I was here. And I found an article that was written in the Naval War College Review from that time about Japan and Japan's naval responsibilities for protecting the sea lanes of communication. And this is an extremely well-written article with all kinds of analysis in it, but nowhere in that article is China even mentioned. And so when Ensign Moodley wrote that article, he was not thinking about China. He was thinking about what was in front of our face at the time, which was Russia. So I'm concerned that if we don't start doing things more quickly, we can't keep up with our competitors who are doing things much more quickly than we are. And we need to start thinking about, if we need a 355-ship Navy, when do we need it? Do we need it now, or do we need it 30 years from now? And I say if the answer is 30 years from now, then whoever says that doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's speed. Number 8, information. Information has become critical to the warfighter. It's a key enabler for warfighting. We have a very, very complicated and unstructured data environment in the Department of the Navy. And so one of the things that I did when I was, as the under was I took on the role of the CIO, because we really didn't have a CIO. And I felt like that particular role needed to be elevated to the highest possible level in the department to get after this. Most businesses, particularly banks, oil and gas companies, large enterprises that rely on data, have made their CIOs almost as powerful as a CEO. Data is the key critical competitive advantage for these companies, and it is for us too. And we've had significant trouble in the management of information, protection, our cybersecurity. Our supplier base is very, 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 very vulnerable. We have people hacking into our systems constantly and stealing information from us. And so we have to get after this. So we have created a new special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, who, I guess that's me now, who is responsible for information management, cyber, digital strategy, digital transformation, data strategy, and cyber. And we're putting a lot of money and a lot of effort behind fixing some of the holes that we have in our systems right now. Number 7 is cost. And I'll use the example of the ships, because it's a good, we're a platform-based service for the most part, or department. When I talked to you about the 600-ship Navy we had when I got out of the Navy, the average cost in real dollars of the ships in that fleet was about $1 billion. That was the average cost. In real dollars today, the average cost of a ship in our fleet is $2 billion. It's twice as expensive. We've put so much more capability on a smaller number of platforms, which makes them extremely capable, but also very vulnerable if you lose them. They're very, very expensive. The carrier itself, the USS Ford, which is our newest aircraft carrier, which is being built, as many of you know, right across the bay here, is $13 billion. For one ship. That's not including the cost of the air wing. So when you look back at how we were operating at the end of the Cold War, the annual cost of operating our carrier fleet and the carrier air wings that supported them was about 14% of the Navy budget, Navy operating budget. Any guesses on what it is now? In excess of 30% of our total operating cost is tied up in these assets that are very expensive. We have fewer of them. And so as someone who's studied competitive strategy in the private sector, that looks like a vulnerability to me. And so we're looking at how we address that. But it's not just the cost of that, it's the cost of everything that we do. We're having significant challenges. We have a $700 billion a year budget, and we're finding that we can't afford to do certain things. It's just a matter of prioritizing and understanding where you want to take risk and not doing the same thing over and over again. Number 6, audit. Any CPAs out here? Oh, you don't have to be embarrassed. So we are going after our first full-scale financial audit in the Navy. It's the first time we actually did it last year for the first time. It's something that when I was in the department 15 years ago, we talked about doing. The Navy was not data ready for that. They're still not data ready for that. It's an incredibly important exercise for us. And I'm just going to give you one example as to why. Anyone who's in private sector, I know there's a lot of banks here, right? If a company comes to you and asks you for a loan and they can't give you auditable financial statements, how willing are you going to be to give them money, right? It's table stakes in business. It should be table stakes for us as well in the government, and particularly in the United States Navy, because we're asking for $160 billion a year from the taxpayers. And so we need to be able to account for that money. But it's not just the accountability portion of it, to give the taxpayers and the Congress assurance that we know what we're doing with this money, which we can't do right now, frankly. But it's also what we're learning through the audit. We found a warehouse through the audit process last year that had about $150 million in aircraft parts in it, down in the Jacksonville area. We didn't know we had the warehouse. We didn't even know we had the parts that were in it, okay? These were aircraft parts for aircraft that we have in our fleet. So when they found these parts and they entered them into our inventory system, within 2 or 3 days, we had $20 million in requisition for parts that were in that warehouse, for aircraft that were down and not flying because we didn't even know we had the parts for it. That's why the audit's important. And that's why it's a huge priority for me that we get after these problems. Same thing with rocket motors. A lot of rocket motors are being held by our supplier base. They don't even know where they are. Okay? So we would not have discovered these things had we not gone through the audit process. Also, all kinds of problems with our IT systems, internal controls, cybersecurity controls. It's all related. We have to get better at what traditionally is known as the back office operations, because it's a huge vulnerability for us. Number 5, education. One thing that I'm absolutely convinced, I can't see into the future. I can't tell you, I can't be as smart as Ensign Moodley was 30 years ago about what's going to be happening 30 years from now. I can tell you that the one thing that's going to be predictable about the future is that it's going to be unpredictable. And so what does that mean for us as a country and a Navy? It means that our competitive advantage is going to be what's between the ears of the people that we put out into the fleet. Because they're going to have to deal with situations that they don't necessarily train for. And they need to have intellectually well-developed minds and ethically well-developed characters. So last year, I commissioned a study, as actually my first month on the job, I commissioned a study to take a look at the naval education process. And I brought in 5 very distinguished people. I sort of stepped away and let them go. It was General John Allen, Admiral Mike Mullen, Ambassador Barbara Barrett, who's now the Secretary of the Air Force, Dr. Harlan Ullman from the War College, and Vice Admiral Ann Rondeau, who's now the President of the Naval Postgraduate School. And they delivered a 300 or 400 page report basically saying that we were not prepared with our education systems in the Navy to address this future, this cognitive future, where we need to have more intellectually well-developed minds. And so I just recently, yesterday, they delivered their report. We came up with an action memo that Secretary Spencer signed out. We've moved out on that this year. We've hired a chief learning officer We are unifying our university systems. We're creating a Naval Community College. We've actually been talking to some of the universities here in the Hampton Roads area to be part of that consortium in the Naval Community College, to give our enlisted people an opportunity to earn degrees while they serve. And I've just shifted over $100 million in funding next year, $200 million the following year, and $350 million a year after that to increase the amount of money we spend on education for our sailors and our Marines, to get us in the ballpark to where competitive organizations are. Most of them spend at least 1% of their budgets on education. We're down below 0.5%. So we're kicking that up substantially. Number 4, adversaries. I've been warned by people in DOD not to call them adversaries, but we have adversaries. The Chinese are our competitors, and in many areas they are our adversaries. They are coming after us in cyberspace relentlessly. They have stolen intellectual property from us. They've stolen military information from us. If you look at some of their hypersonic missiles, that's all our technology that they've stolen, and we sort of stepped away from that technology during what we thought that there would be a peace dividend for us. And that's allowed our competitors to really advance on us. And so our adversaries are very, very aggressive. They're the traditional large ones, the great powers, the great competitors we talk about, the Chinese and the Russians. But there's also, when I talk to people about this, I lay these all out, and then I have a thing flash up on the screen that says Iran in quotation marks. Because Iran is a problem now, but it may not be a problem tomorrow. And something else is going to flash up on the screen that's going to capture our attention. It could be a nation state, it could be an individual. We have to be prepared, and we have to be prepared across that broad spectrum of conflicts, because that's not going to get less complicated. That's going to get more complicated. And so what that requires, from my perspective, is having an agile force, agile platforms, agile people, agile minds, in order to deal with that. Number 3 is warriors. I met some wounded warriors today before this luncheon, and we've been at war for 20 years, almost. And it's putting a huge strain on our warriors. It's putting a huge strain on their families. I had the distinct privilege of meeting a sergeant who was doing some work for an interagency agreement that I signed off on. In January, he got hit with shrapnel in Afghanistan, and I asked if he wanted to come home, and he said no, he wanted to stay on the mission, and 3 weeks later, he got both of his legs blown off in Afghanistan. And he came home, and I met him at Walter Reed, and I was speaking to him, and I said, "What are you going to do next?" And he said, "Well, sir, I'm going to get fitted with prostheses, I'm going to learn how to walk, and I'm going to go back over to Afghanistan, however I can." And I said, "Why do you want to do that?" He said, "Sir, because I don't know how to do anything else." He's probably 38 years old. He's been doing this for 18 years. And that's not sustainable. And so we need to think about how that impacts our culture. As you know, my boss lost his job over an issue related to this, related to culture, some challenges we're having in the special warfare community that we absolutely have to get after. I'm not going to speak to any of the specific cases, but I think the broader issue is we need to heal within the special warfare community and understand what the ethos is of that community, which is very clearly articulated by them themselves. And how do we ensure and how do we help them to live up to that? But it's a hard, hard challenge when you're doing this for this amount of time. Number 2, time. Time is our biggest constraint. It's not working to our advantage. And all these other factors I talked about, we have to get after these problems quickly. And for me, even up until 2 weeks ago when I wasn't acting secretary, as the undersecretary, I felt tremendous urgency that I'd only be in this undersecretary job for another year, and that I had a very short time frame to get things done. That's why my first 2 years I was running so fast, because I wanted to get people and processes and organizations in place that will allow us at least a year to start executing on a lot of these things. But time is not our friend, and we need to have some continuity in leadership and driving these incredibly important changes and transformation of our naval forces so that they're suited for that unpredictable future that we're talking about. And number one, I'm glad guys are all glad that I'm at number one, finally. I spoke at the USS Indianapolis commissioning a couple weeks ago, about a month ago, in Burns Harbor, Indiana, which I didn't even know they had any waterfront in Indiana, but they do, right on Lake Michigan. And it was a freezing cold day, but I really, when I go and speak at groups like that, I really want to make sure the speech is right, and so I tried to relate it to, again, David. My top 10 list of what you should remember about this day. And I think all that anyone was going to remember about that day is it was freezing cold and raining, and that someone decided to go through 10 things in their speech. So I could see, like, as I was going down the list and I got to number 5, people started clapping like I was done. So luckily it's, climate controlled in here. But anyway, number one is memories. Now, I'm certain that you say this last one might seem a little perplexing to you. Memories of what? What's he talking about? And what I'm referring to is our collective memories as a nation. It's the common understanding of what is good about this country, this place, these places, like Hampton Roads, and what makes them so unique in the history of civilization. Quoting my favorite president again, in 1984, President Reagan captured this idea on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc in Normandy on the 40th anniversary of the D-Day invasion of Europe by our Allied forces. And political analysts have used this speech over and over to talk about how brilliant it was politically because it tapped into a shared understanding of what Americans believed in their hearts and how this was going to help him in his election and so on and so forth. But it really is just more important about shared memories and about sacrifices and the reason for those sacrifices made by our soldiers, sailors, and airmen on that day. Reagan's words were far more than political. And to judge them purely as political diminishes their power and the authenticity of them. The memory of Normandy that President Reagan evoked was real. It wasn't fabricated. It tapped into a collective consciousness in which moral clarity and pride in American sacrifice and achievement were unambiguous. So why is memory the number one thing on the list of the things that would keep me up at night if things actually kept me up at night? Because every waking hour, it keeps me up with the concern that we may be losing that shared memory as a nation. As powerful forces in the media and some in politics and academia and nefarious foreign actors who are really adept at manipulating all of these institutions, seek to create a new shared memory for Americans, focused instead on our historical flaws, our past injustices, our cultural and racial differences, and our inability to secure an impossible utopian ideal for society. Around this time last year, Robin and I had the honor of hosting a native son of Virginia, Mr. Emory Crowder, at a performance of The Messiah at our home near Annapolis at the Naval Academy. Emory is a 96-year-old veteran of World War II and a recipient of the Silver Star. He served as a corpsman in the Marine Corps, so he's one of those unique characters who bridged Navy and Marine Corps at the same time. He's one of those unique characters who was authorized to wear both the Marine Corps uniform and the Navy uniform at his discretion. He stormed the beaches in Saipan and in Tinian, and he saved lives under fire with what equipment he could. For his bravery, he was rewarded with the opportunity to then go and invade Okinawa. And he never made it to Okinawa, as the ship was sunk by a kamikaze pilot, and he was rescued from the cold Pacific Ocean with several of his friends surrounded by sharks 7 hours later. I'll never forget how after that performance of The Messiah, he was surrounded by midshipmen, young midshipmen, possibly one of the midshipmen who was an ensign who we lost on Friday, who took pictures with him and thanked him for his service. In response to these midshipmen, all of whom were born well after the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, well after the time that I was a midshipman, Emory simply said, "Thank you. I did it so that you could have this life." And what are those young mids doing with this life? They are stepping forward to serve, to forge that next link in the chain. Emory Crowder is what is good about our nation. Those mids are what is good about our nation. These young Navy heroes who stepped into the line of fire to save their classmates in Pensacola last Friday are what is good about our nation. And that is the memory we should all fight to preserve. We cannot ask people to defend this nation if we don't believe the nation is good and worth defending. And in my opinion, it's immoral to do so. We need to embrace fully and nurture the shared memories of the past that reinforce this, not blindly, but with a renewed sense of belief that we can address our problems, our divisions, and strive for a more perfect union every day. A union that is worthy of every soul who puts his or her life in harm's way to keep us safe and to keep us free. For we've been here before, and sometimes it is important to place the events of our lives into a different perspective. Again, Churchill ended that speech in Harvard in 1943 with the following words, quote, let all of us who are here remember that we are on this stage of history, and that whatever our station may be and whatever part we have to play, great or small, our conduct is liable to be scrutinized not only by history, but by our own descendants. I think we would agree today we may be at an inflection point in the history of our country. And it is especially true for the citizens of Hampton Roads, who have such a crucial role to play in creating our naval readiness and in building and sustaining our naval future. For it is what we do now for the future of our national security that counts the most, not just for ourselves, but most importantly for our children and their children and their children. Thank you sincerely for all you do for our country, for how you treat our veterans, for how you treat our active duty service members. When you see them, don't just thank them. Encourage them, ask them about themselves, and be grateful that someone in their lives told them that serving in the naval service of the United States was a good and honorable thing to do. May God bless you all. May God continue to bless this nation. Go Navy, go Marine Corps, go Hampton Roads, and of course, as always, beat Army. Thank you.